The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host. And on this episode from the 2026 GPS Leaders Forum, we sit down with Dr. Brian Stampfl from Valley Veterinary Services, based in Northeast Wisconsin, as he and GPS team member Trent Dado dig into disease prevention through biosecurity and how dairy producers can implement simple practices to manage animal health and minimize risk.
Well, thanks, Brian. Excellent presentation. I know biosecurity probably isn't the first topic everybody lines up to listen to, but thought that you did a great job of keeping it practical and logical and a way that guys can take stuff back to their dairy. So in today's conversation, I wanted to follow up on a few items. And I think the first one that I think you did a nice job elaborating on, I wish you could do it again if you could, would be defining a little bit about biosecurity and maybe the difference between kind of that external stuff, preventing stuff from outside versus the stuff that normally happens day to day on a dairy.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you can think about biosecurity, and if you read literature about it, there's actually kind of two technical terms. Biosecurity, from a technical standpoint, is the ability to keep stuff out of your dairy that you don't want and is possible to keep out of your dairy. There are certain bugs that we just live with as cattle producers, as veterinarians, because they're just not going to go away. No amount of biosecurity is going to keep rotavirus, coronavirus, cryptosporidium out of calves forever. That would be more termed biocontainment, something that you're living with on your dairy. You do what you can to try and manage through that, keep stuff clean, but you're not ever going to absolutely exclude that pathogen from your dairy. Biosecurity is more like if we really want to keep stuff out. And I think about it really on a few different levels. You can kind of think about it on the maybe more of the barn level, which would be kind of the biocontainment thing. This is how we keep calf scours down in our calf barn. Mm-hmm. We manage traffic. We clean maternity really well. These are our sanitation protocols. Yep. And then you can go up one step to more of the farm level where I don't want BVD, I don't want whatever it is, BLV. I've decided that I want to keep these certain things out of my herd. We use vaccination strategies, we use test and cull strategies, sanitation obviously goes without saying, and then that's where I got into more of the strategies about that we're not very good at doing, which would be managing traffic around the dairy, managing who visits, and what their sort of sanitation protocols are for visiting your dairy. Beyond that, there's like the state or regional level and then like the national level, which would be, we've got national control programs for stuff like tuberculosis, brucellosis, stuff like foot and mouth that we want to keep actually out of the country. So it depends on kind of how you want to focus on it. It can be a really, really big topic, but where I tried to focus today was more about what are the sorts of things that are leaving your dairy and our industry as a whole more susceptible to these emerging pathogens that we've seen, like H5N1 flu, now potentially New World screwworm, stuff like that.
You talked a little bit about, biosecurity being not exciting. There's no energy by the dairy to participate in doing anything around biosecurity, which I think is interesting because when you think about controlling mastitis or controlling salmonella on the dairy, there's a lot of energy. People are into setting protocols and things to prepare their dairies for those. But when we start talking about protecting the dairy from these outside diseases, there's a lot less enthusiasm to do stuff in this arena. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's mostly due to people being able to see what's in front of them with regard to mastitis, salmonella, or some of the other things that you mentioned. Some of those things are right in their face and affect them economically right now, or a lot of them do, right? Whereas I feel like protecting yourself from an outside disease threat is more of a theoretical sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I covered that our friends in the swine and poultry industries have crossed the threshold into these things not being theoretical for them. They've really endured some really serious disease outbreaks industry-wide and have had to change their management practices to adjust to that. H5N1 flu, I think, is the first time in a long time that we've had to critically evaluate our practices as a dairy industry and say, maybe we've been getting away with some stuff for quite a while that wouldn't really fly if some of these diseases were more prevalent. So from controlling mastitis, controlling some other infectious things, I think you have to, because it's right in front of your face. It affects your bottom line. Your employees are seeing it, and it's just not this thing that's sort of out there floating around in the ether of like, maybe someday there might be some kind of biosecurity threat. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that some of these things that we do deal with on a regular basis, whether it is contagious mastitis or something like that, are managed with the same principles that would keep you protected from a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. The amount of testing that you could do to prevent the introduction of, let's say, mycoplasma or Staph aureus or something like that, it's all the same, right? So it's just using good protocols, making sure that you're testing new arrivals, controlling access, and just keeping your wits about you on who all is coming to the dairy and what risks that you have.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I want to double back to something that you said, that like the swine and poultry industries are probably much more advanced in terms of their biosecurity measures. Is there a specific scientific reason, like the difference between the way that we manage or the difference between the species themselves, that why swine and poultry are more at risk or have harder times with biosecurity issues?
Yeah, I think generally pigs and chickens themselves just kind of are virus factories. They, as a species, are a lot more susceptible, and they not only are really susceptible, but they really amplify virus when they get exposed. And so you can have a few flu particles that go into a turkey barn or a chicken barn, and however many trillions of particles that come out of that barn, and that represents a really big risk to the next farm down the road. Certain diseases that they have are also spread because they're viral. They get carried on the air. That aerosol transmission is a huge risk. And so we just haven't really dealt with stuff like that in the cattle industry that much. Most of our biosecurity failures, I would say, have been with stuff that's more like, for example, hairy heel warts. Something that the feedlot industry, I don't think, really has dealt with much at all until we start getting all these dairy-influenced calves into feed yards, and now all of a sudden we're going, what is going on with all the hairy heel warts around? So that's a biosecurity failure. That's us as an industry lacking the systems in place to prevent that from getting from one farm to another. And I don't mean to condemn it's no one person's fault. It's all of our collective, quote unquote, fault. It's just a matter of the fact that we have so much connectedness within the cattle industry, and without some significant effort and a lot of time, and maybe honestly a little bit of extra motivation with recent events, that we can make some positive headway that way.
Yeah, I think that was one thing that really caught my attention, is that the dairy industry is at a pretty big risk of biosecurity. You mentioned we're moving cattle around. Interstate travel is very, very common on the daily dairy. And also the number, you mentioned shared vendors, the number of nutritionists and veterinarians and feed trucks and manure trucks that are all coming in and out of dairies. Yeah. So with all these risk factors, biosecurity seems kind of futile, even to try. Is it still worth doing it, even with all these extra risk factors?
You could take the approach that, well, if something comes, we're going to get it, we'll deal with it when it gets here. I certainly wouldn't fault anybody for having that mentality, because it just does seem to be the way that flu kind of unfolded. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we should let that stop us from making some positive changes. Even if you just think about it from the standpoint of your own farm, and maybe it's not the theoretical threat of foot and mouth disease that you're trying to control, but there are almost certainly some management practices that you're doing on your farm that could be improved, that will make your cattle healthier and reduce the amount of risk that you have. I shared the example of how much traffic goes in and out of one end of the barn for one of my clients. We have maternity and fresh cows and those newborn calves all in one end, and in the same end of the barn that's the place where dead animals get picked up. That's where all the calves get picked up. Feed trucks go in and out. Cull cows leave out of those doors. That's a lot of activity in one area, let alone the foot traffic from people who have been in pens, walking through the maternity area, cleaning up in the maternity work area. That sort of stuff is the sort of thing that, if you are suddenly experiencing a salmonella or an E. coli outbreak in really young calves, those are the sorts of places that you need to look. How did we get a bunch of manure contamination in these calves? Well, that vet that just went out and palpated 200 cows and got all full of manure just cleaned up in your maternity area right next to your colostrum feeding equipment, right? So you need to set up your dairy in any way that you can to allow people to make good decisions about what they're doing. So why do I go and clean up in that area? That's the only place that there's water, right, to clean myself up. So we need to think about these sorts of things that you can make small changes to protect your animals, and you don't have to go all the way to putting up a bunch of fences, controlling access, trying to, funnel everybody through one entrance. Although in the long run, I think as time goes on and if we have more of these disease outbreaks and that kind of thing, we're going to see more and more of that, because I think people will be motivated to say, okay, we can't handle, let's say, H5N1 flu, a hallmark of flu viruses is that they mutate. We can't handle another one of these flu outbreaks with a new variant on our farm. It's just too much to handle. And we're going to do whatever we can to keep it out. It's not going to apply to every dairy. It's not going to apply to every situation. But over time, I think we just have to start taking some of these little steps that will move us in a positive direction. Certainly, there's not going to be overnight change, right?
Yeah, and that's where probably one thing that resonated for me was the fact that the biosecurity just needs to be part of the conversation. From my experience, talking through expansions or even on dairy, biosecurity probably comes up. Probably never. I think part of the concept is, it is important. So if we are designing a new facility, that obviously there's a list of priorities, efficiency and production, but just get biosecurity on the list, right? It's
just get it in the conversation, get it a seat at the table, and I think we'll be a little bit farther ahead, certainly. That is what I would recommend to anybody who's putting in a new facility, is try and think about how people will move through the facility and how best to protect your animals. And then from there, everything else sort of steps up from there. You can build on it.
GPS Dairy Consulting is proud to highlight their sister company, AgriGrowth Solutions. AGS is a team of financial consultants with strong dairy backgrounds who represent and work for the best interests of dairy producers. The AGS team works independently for the dairy producer to guide them through their business's financial position and planning for their continued and future success. Partial budgeting and asset management modeling, along with key performance indicator scorecards, are the future of dairy financial tracking and management, and AGS leads the industry in these service offerings. AgriGrowth Solutions provides leadership, experience, and solutions to ensure their clients' financial success. Learn more at agrigrowthsolutions.com.
So if you had a client that comes to you, they heard your presentation, or like, yeah, Brian, I agree with you. I need to ramp up my biosecurity game.
Yeah.
And they're like, what should my first steps be? What would you recommend as step 1, step 2, step 3?
Well, first I would say let's look at our processes on the dairy and let's look at ourselves first before we worry about necessarily how we're going to ask others to change their behavior. Let's change our behavior. How do we give our employees the education and the knowledge to just put it in their heads as they're working in the facility how best to control these diseases? An example is, like, I obviously through vet school and just working on dairies, I have exposure to that biosecurity training. And just in the back of my head, there are certain things that I do during the day that set off a little alarm bell that say, that is not the most biosecure thing that you could be doing, right?
Give me an example of that.
I have a dirty clothes bin in my truck. So I always change my coveralls between farms, but all those dirty clothes go into one bin. How often do I clean that bin out? Never, right? So I'm carrying around, and like, how often do my floor mats in my truck get cleaned, right? Or disinfected, that kind of stuff. When I go and, let's say, necropsy some calves, or I'm out working up a calf situation with a lot of rotavirus and stuff like that, I know that I have that stuff on me. If I crawl in my truck with my dirty boots and like get it all over my floor mats, the next time I step out of that truck, I know I'm moving it around that farm. That's the sort of stuff that, just if you can kind of put it in your head and help put it in your employees' heads, that maybe I shouldn't be walking around this way after I've already been with contaminated cattle. That's the sort of stuff that I think makes a bigger difference. That's also one of the hardest things, because I'll talk to people all the time who are, let's say they're a younger generation on a farm and they're the ones who are managing these facilities. Let's say it's a calf facility. And they're really, really frustrated with the amount of scours that they have. And if I come in and I recommend, like, hey, there are some things like, we've got way too much traffic going through this calf barn. We're washing manure-covered equipment right outside the barn. We're washing our hutches right outside the barn. People are through here all the time. Let's start managing access just to this barn. Keep people out. Essential people only, people who are feeding, that kind of stuff. And let's move all these washing processes around. The feedback that I often get is like, well, my dad's never going to do that. He's never going to stay out of here. And so it's just this it's all about changing behavior. And that is one of the hardest things to do. Biosecurity concepts themselves, they're not complicated. Stay clean. Don't move through clean areas with dirty boots, stuff like that. Manage access to barns. It's just that behavior, because additional biosecurity steps can be inconvenient. They can create extra work, and you just need to have somebody everybody needs to be bought in to be able to make it work. Yeah, so it's an uphill battle for sure.
It's a cultural change more than anything. So
yeah.
I derailed the question a little bit, but the steps, it's probably first, foremost, and maybe entirely just a cultural thing.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Keep biosecurity top of mind, talk about as your team,
yes.
Change the way amongst generations do it. That's
and the way that you talk about controlling disease on your farm and just bring it up in conversations. Start there, and then evaluate what risks you have for exposure to the outside world. Where do people access barns where they need to, let's say, pick up animals or pick up dead cows and stuff like that? Can you move those things to an area that is lower impact? I gave the example of dead cows being right next to maternity in that farm. Is that really where they need to be? I understand that that's a convenient place for them to be because it's right next to a door. We don't really have another place for them outside, but is that the best place for them? And I think as you go through your dairy and critically evaluate your processes, you're going to find things that are like that maybe you could improve. And then, if you came to me and you said, I don't want foot and mouth if it comes. You're talking about a whole other level of biosecurity that would be completely shut off from completely controlled access, decontamination, clean and dirty lines of separation. And those, I just think, while they're good things to put on a piece of paper, good things for you to think about, especially if you're going to go through some of the recommended stuff like from the USDA about controlling bird flu. They'll recommend lines of separation and that kind of thing. They're just mostly pretty unrealistic right now for where we're at, because our facilities just aren't really set up and our dairies aren't really set up to be really good at that. But if you can just think through that process of, okay, if the worst happened and we wanted to lock this place down, how would we control access and provide sanitation protocols for anyone that's coming onto this dairy? And that's a place that you can start, but don't bite off more than you can chew, I guess.
Yeah. You had mentioned two big risks, biosecurity risks, in New World screwworm and foot and mouth, was it?
Yeah.
Could you just quickly diagnose those in terms of what the risk level is and how aware dairies need to be about them?
Well, certainly screwworm is the one that's kind of got our attention right now, because this is a pathogen that we eradicated from the United States some 60 years ago, but did have a major effect on the beef cattle industry in particular in South Texas and maybe some other places. But I think what's for Midwestern dairies, a lot that I work with, we don't necessarily need to worry about the bug itself because it gets cold here. It's like a tropical, subtropical fly, and we're not really worried about it living here. But the impact to the industry of it getting into the United States could be significant, whether it's movement restrictions on animals coming out of affected areas, effects on the cattle or milk markets. I'm not sure. I mean, there are a lot of folks out there who are a lot smarter than me about markets and what they might do in that situation. But I have to think that that's kind of if you're going to pay attention to one, that's the one to pay attention to right now. Foot and mouth has been around forever. It's always been a foreign animal disease risk. There's nothing in my mind that says right now we're at any higher risk than we've ever really been. It's one of the ones that gets brought up all the time. For example, if you go to secure milk supply, some of the best, most thorough biosecurity recommendations can be found through secure milk supply. And those are built on the idea that if we got foot and mouth, these were the things that we are going to need to be able to do. And we are not there as an industry, right? Just with the way our facilities are designed and the amount of movement that we have. But it's something to really, if you want to dive into it, that's the place I would go to start and just see what things apply to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brian, for the conversation. Is there any final words that you want to leave with the audience?
Well, I would just say do what you can. There's no reason that you can't just look at your dairy and say, how could we make animal health a little bit better by improving how we move around this facility and what our practices are? There's probably some low-hanging fruit there, and it could have a bigger impact than you think.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
All right.
You just heard from Dr. Brian Stampfl from Valley Veterinary Services and Trent Dado, GPS Dairy Consultant, here on the GPS DairyCAST. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, and we look forward to you joining us for our next episode of the GPS DairyCAST.
The GPS DairyCAST features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCAST has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.